Welcome to week 7. Starting in chapter 9 of our primary text, it's a chapter that outlines some of the basic features of ethics. These include ethical judgment, tradition, values, duties, and responsibilities. The authors describe 5 frameworks for understanding how communication functions in crisis and risk situations from an ethical standpoint. These frameworks are sometimes described as moral theories, and they function to describe, inform, and critique choices and behaviors. Now, a significant challenge from moral theory has been to develop frameworks that accommodate the wide variability of cultural traditions and values. Think about your own organization, your own community, your own family, yourself, and all the variations that are apparent within those different worldviews. Well, that's true of studying ethics as well, or morality. So keep in mind that as you look at these studies, you'll see some diversity between what one person thinks is moral, ethical, and what another person thinks is moral or ethical. And of course that plays out on an organizational and even community level as well. All right, so during a crisis, organizations and agencies may withhold information or temporarily postpone its release for a variety of reasons. And they do so sometimes justifiably for ethical reasons. In the case of an airline disaster, your authors talk about, sometimes they withhold the names of family members, names of victims until they can notify family members. We do something similar in the military. In fact, there's a law that restricts us from providing the name of a service member killed until after 24 hours after a family member or the next of kin has been notified. So this presents a challenge, right? Because the news media want that information. The public, because it is a service members for whom they support, want that information. The other challenge is that once we notify that next of kin, typically that next of kin will share with family members and word gets out pretty quick. And so when I was a Pentagon press officer, it was very common for media to call me and ask for confirmation of the death of a service member. And I had to explain that we're not allowed to do that. The law prohibits us from releasing the name or confirming the name of a service member until 24 hours after next of kin notification has been complete. And usually, once you explain to the reporter why that is, they were usually pretty accommodating. You might find yourself in similar situations, not just with next of kin notification for casualties, but there may be other ethical reasons why withholding that information is required. But typically, it would be unethical, obviously, to withhold information that is relevant to a crisis situation, especially if that information impacts members of the public. All right. Last thing about Chapter 9, I'll encourage you to look at Table 9.1 on page 223. These are the principles of conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movements and other non-government organizations in disaster relief. All of them may not directly apply to the projects you're working on in this course or in your own organization, but the basic principles will apply, and you'll find some good information in there, I believe. All right, the first article I'll discuss this week is Bone and Zing, 2015, Auto Recall Crisis, Framing and Ethical Response. It's about the Toyota case, and it employs a content analysis to basically compare the news coverage concerning Toyota's recall with the information that Toyota put out about the recall. And it tries to look at the media frame and how the media frame impacts the understanding of the issue from a public perspective. The study also explored how media frame the crisis type for Toyota's product recalls. Obviously, Toyota would like to frame the recalls as accidental events, but mass media tended to frame them urging responsibility, or a responsibility frame as preventable events. So accidental versus preventable. Those are the two kind of frames. One Toyota wanted, obviously accidental. The other that the mass media reported, which was preventable. It reminds me of what a protocol officer once told me. She'd been a protocol officer for 30-something years, and I was a relatively young lieutenant. And we were working a community relations event, and things weren't going quite as well as planned. And she said, "Lieutenant, you may be in charge, but you are never fully in control." And it kind of calmed me down, kind of gave me some perspective, and I've carried that perspective with me to this day. You may be in charge, but you never really have full control. And once you accept that, you can go about mitigating, especially in a crisis, those kinds of things that might go against your strategy or even the tactics that you're trying to employ. All right, next article. Franson and Johansson from 2010, Apologizing in a Globalizing World. The purpose of the paper was to study 3 apologies offered by the Vatican and Pope Benedict XVI. There was a much debated speech that the Pope gave at the University of Regensburg in Germany, and I won't go into the details here for brevity's sake. I'll let you read that, but there was a rhetorical model of apologizing and apologetic ethics that was proposed by Herrick. And the authors took that Herrick proposal for apologizing and apologetic ethics, and they used that to study this theory, or to test this theory as part of their study of Pope Benedict XVI's response, as well as the Vatican's messages. Concerning the manner of communication, typically an apology used as a crisis response strategy has to live up to some ethical standards. And some of those that your authors recommend in this paper anyway are: the apology must be truthful, it must be sincere, it must be voluntary, it must be timely, it must address all stakeholders, and it must be performed in an appropriate context. Now that's a lot to try to boil into an apology. But you'll see as the authors describe this, how important each of those elements are for an apology. It's one of the reasons why it's really, really difficult to appropriately apologize during a crisis. Also concerning the manner of communication, an apology used as a crisis response strategy must also live up to some ideal ethical standards in addition to those that we just discussed. They include expressing regret, explicitly acknowledging wrongdoing, accepting full responsibility, identifying with injured stakeholders, asking for forgiveness, seeking reconciliation, and fully disclosing information that's related to the offense. Again, these are a lot of things to try to boil down into an apology, but they're things that as communicators we should be aware of in terms of any communication that we have that take the form of an apology during a crisis. All right, so that's the Franson and Johansson article. Let's switch over to the Ulmer and Selnow article, Consistent Questions of Ambiguity in Organizational Crisis Communication. This is about the Jack in the Box case study. The authors use this study to explore the ethical ramifications of ambiguous communication. They use the Jack in the Box case study, and they apply the stakeholder theory to ascertain the ethical implications of employing strategic ambiguity in organizational crisis communication. Essentially, they conclude that the crisis response provided by the Jack in the Box leaders was ethically questionable in the areas of evidence, intent, and locus. And they came to that conclusion because the ambiguity they introduced privileged their financial stakeholders over others. In other words, they put profit ahead of people. So be careful with that. That's almost never a good strategy, especially when you're dealing with something that negatively impacts members of the public. You need to prioritize your stakeholders, and it's not all about profit. That almost never ends well. The challenge for any organization, as your authors note, is that you can communicate quickly and you want to communicate accurately, but sometimes it's really hard to do in a crisis. I have been quoted as saying, do you want it right or do you want it right now? Because typically you can't get both. Right? It's just really, really tough to get accurate information in a timely manner. But that's what we're called to do, timely and accurate as possible. Now, your authors note that if handled effectively, organizations do have the potential to benefit from crisis. There are some examples of that. The Tylenol case back in it was in the 70s or 80s. That case, actually, because they handled it so well, not just from a communication perspective, but more importantly from an operational perspective, clearing all the shelves, taking steps, apologizing, taking responsibility, all those things that we want to see in good crisis communication. They did that, and it actually it boosted the trust and confidence that the public had in that organization. All right. Final article for this week that I'll review is the Coombs and Holiday article about Amazon.com's Orwellian nightmare, exploring apology in an online environment. The purpose of the paper was to contribute to the understanding of crisis communication application and theory. They did so by analyzing online reactions of discussion board participants to assess the effectiveness of an apology issued online by Amazon. As I always do, I'm not going to go into the details of the case. I'll let you read that, but I just want to hit some highlights for you. Their goal of the exploratory research was to examine the Kindle community discussion board, and more specifically the reactions to an online apology from Jeff Bezos. And I'll just briefly read the research questions because I think that kind of helps us understand how we can do this kind of research and the importance of this research as it applies to crisis communication. One of the research questions asked, how did the Kindle company postings indicate the apology was received by this community? Right? Focused on the community. How did the Kindle community postings indicate the apology affected the behavioral intentions of these writers? In other words, what are you going to do about it? Did reactions to the apologies differ for Kindle owners and Kindle non-owners? It's important, especially if you're in a business trying to attract new customers. And then what suggestions for additional corrective action appear in the posts? So those are some good research questions. You might be able to use some of those, if not specifically to this case, maybe other cases that you're researching. And then finally, your authors note that there's an important trend in crisis communication research, and that trend is to move from a sender perspective to a receiver or stakeholder perspective. Okay? So it's not about what we want in the organization, it's about what our stakeholders need. Right? This should surprise no one, especially anyone who has a background in communication. Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all preach the same thing. Good communication begins with your audience. It's all about your audience. Crisis communication, no exception. All right, you're doing well. Keep it up. Make sure you stay ahead with all assignments. Stay engaged in that discussion board. And of course, as always, enjoy this time of learning.